You think you know about World War I armies? Think again. What if I told you that British commanders banned parachutes because they thought pilots would become cowards, that soldiers developed the three-on-a-match superstition after watching snipers pick off the third man to light a cigarette, or that France issued up to 0.75 liters of wine per soldier per day, roughly 3 standard bottles of modern wine? These aren't your typical World War I stories. Today we're examining the most bizarre, shocking, and downright unbelievable moments from the 5 major armies of the Great War. Some of these facts are so strange they sound like fiction, but every single one is documented history. British Army's bizarre superstitions and deadly honor code. Let's examine how the British Army's obsession with honor created some of the war's most devastating decisions. The Royal Flying Corps made a choice that sounds like it came from a comedy sketch rather than military headquarters. British pilots were forbidden from carrying parachutes during combat missions. This wasn't because parachutes were too heavy or too expensive. The Air Board's reasoning was that having an escape option would make pilots cowardly and encourage them to abandon perfectly good aircraft that could still make it back to base. No parachutes were issued until late 1918, meaning thousands of aviators died in crashes they could have survived. British commanders preferred dead heroes to living pilots who might retreat. This rigid honor-over-survival mentality infected every level of the British military. Soldiers developed their own elaborate superstition systems to cope with the absurdity. The three-on-a-match belief became widespread after soldiers noticed that lighting 3 cigarettes from one match gave enemy snipers enough time to spot and target the third man. Others insisted on wearing the same unwashed socks for weeks, believing clean socks would bring death. Some units performed pre-battle rituals that involved passing around photographs of sweethearts exactly 7 times while reciting made-up Latin phrases. These ceremonies often took longer than actual battle preparations, but commanders allowed them because superstitious soldiers fought harder than terrified ones. The British PALS battalion system created one of the war's most heartbreaking disasters. Entire neighborhoods, football clubs, and factory workforces enlisted together with the promise they could serve alongside their friends. The Accrington PALS battalion recruited 700 men from the same small town. On July 1, 1916, during the first day of the Somme offensive, 584 of those men were killed or wounded within 20 minutes. The town of Accrington lost nearly every male between the ages of 18 and 35 in less than half an hour, with entire streets of families receiving death telegrams on the same day. British equipment failures reached levels that bordered on criminal negligence. Gas masks presented a deadly problem where early models fogged up so severely that soldiers wearing them became completely blind within minutes. Many troops chose to risk poison gas exposure rather than stumble around unable to see enemy attacks. The masks also had a tendency to slip during combat, creating gaps that let in the very gases they were supposed to filter out. Silent raids became a desperate British specialty that sounds absurd but actually worked. Soldiers would remove their heavy boots and crawl across no man's land wearing only socks or barefoot. These missions required men to slither through mud, barbed wire, and corpses without making any sound. Some successful raids involved 50 men crawling 200 yards in complete silence, cutting through German wire with hand tools, and returning with prisoners. The technique was so effective that German sentries often couldn't detect British soldiers until they were already inside the trenches. Field Punishment Number 1 represented British military discipline at its most medieval. Soldiers guilty of minor infractions were shackled to wheels for hours in view of enemy fire, a punishment that caused lasting nerve damage. The practice continued even after military doctors reported that extended periods in this position caused permanent damage to soldiers' bodies. British cavalry charges persisted with shocking stubbornness well into 1917, long after machine guns had proven that horses couldn't survive modern warfare. The Cavalry Brigade at High Wood in September 1916 saw 150 mounted soldiers charge directly into German machine gun positions. Within minutes, nearly every horse was dead, and most riders were casualties. Yet, British commanders continued planning mounted attacks, convinced that the psychological impact of charging horses would break enemy morale. Shell shock statistics reveal the British Army's cruel contradiction regarding mental health. British soldiers suffered shell shock at rates nearly double those of French or German troops, with over 80,000 documented cases. Yet the British military executed more of their own soldiers for cowardice and desertion than any other army in the war. Many men shot for cowardice were actually suffering from what we now recognize as severe PTSD. Medical officers who tried to diagnose shell shock were often overruled by commanders who insisted that British soldiers didn't break down mentally. The result was that traumatized men were either shot by firing squads or sent back to the front lines without treatment. Trench foot became such an epidemic that some British units reported more casualties from foot rot than from enemy action. The condition occurred when soldiers' feet remained wet and cold for extended periods, causing tissue to decay while still attached to the body. In severe cases, toes and entire sections of feet would turn black and fall off. Some battalions had over 30% of their men incapacitated by trench foot at any given time. Military doctors eventually realized that rotating dry socks and whale oil treatments could prevent the condition, but supply shortages meant many units went months without clean, dry footwear. The ban on Tommy cookers created one final absurd hardship for British soldiers. These small portable stoves allowed troops to heat food and water, but commanders discovered that enemy snipers could spot the tiny flames from hundreds of yards away. Rather than develop better camouflage or safer heating methods, British command simply banned hot food at the front lines. Soldiers spent months eating cold bully beef, hardtack biscuits, and lukewarm tea. Some troops tried to heat food using body heat or by leaving tins in sunny spots, but these methods rarely worked in the cold, wet trenches. The irony was that German soldiers had similar portable stoves but used them with better concealment techniques, meaning they enjoyed hot meals while British soldiers shivered over cold rations just a few hundred yards away. While the British struggled with their rigid honor codes and equipment failures, their French allies were developing their own unique approach to maintaining soldier morale. French Army's wine rations and mutiny madness. The French Army took an approach to soldier morale that would make modern military planners question their sanity. French troops received up to 0.75 liters of wine daily by the war's end, starting from an initial quarter-liter ration. This wasn't table wine either. The military-issued wine often reached alcohol levels of 12 to 15%, meaning French soldiers were consuming more alcohol daily than most people drink in a week. The reasoning was simple. Drunk soldiers complained less about dying in trenches. The practice became so essential to French military operations that wine supply lines received the same priority as ammunition shipments. French military doctrine became obsessed with aggressive tactics to an almost religious degree. The army's cult of the offensive mentality emphasized direct assaults and bayonet charges, even in the face of modern weaponry. This belief in the decisive power of close combat led to specialized training programs that treated hand-to-hand fighting with scientific precision. Soldiers spent months mastering techniques they would use for perhaps 30 seconds in actual combat if they survived long enough to engage in close fighting. French punishment methods reached levels of psychological cruelty that bordered on torture. Commanders dealing with mutinous soldiers would force them to dig their own graves in elaborate detail, complete with proper dimensions and headstone placement. The condemned men would spend hours or even days preparing their burial sites before mock executions that stopped just short of actual firing. Guards would load rifles with blanks, march prisoners to freshly dug graves, and go through complete execution procedures before revealing the deception. Some soldiers endured this process multiple times as punishment for repeat offenses. The psychological impact often proved more devastating than actual punishment, with many men preferring real execution to repeated mock deaths. French experiments with armored vehicles produced disasters that sound like engineering comedy sketches. Military designers created armored cars so heavy they sank into mud within minutes of deployment. These vehicles weighed over 4 tons but had narrow wheels designed for city streets, not battlefield terrain. During field tests, the machines became stuck before traveling 100 meters. Crews tried pulling these contraptions out with teams of horses, but the cars were so heavy that multiple horses died from exhaustion. Some armored cars required 20 men to push them across flat ground, making them slower than walking infantry. Engineers kept adding more armor to protect crews, making the vehicles even heavier and more useless. Trench art became a French military obsession that defied all logic about battlefield priorities. Soldiers created elaborate sculptures from spent shell casings while battles raged around them. French troops carved intricate designs into artillery shells, fashioned decorative items from bullet casings, and built furniture from weapons debris. Some men spent entire days creating art pieces instead of maintaining equipment or preparing defenses. Units competed to create the most elaborate sculptures, with soldiers trading food rations for artistic materials. Officers initially tried to stop this practice, but discovered that artistic soldiers had better morale and lower desertion rates. Eventually, the military officially encouraged trench art, providing tools and materials for creative projects. Some trenches resembled art galleries more than military positions, with carved sculptures lining walkways and decorated shells displayed like museum pieces. French commanders desperate for any advantage turned to fortune tellers and mediums for military planning guidance. General headquarters employed professional psychics to predict enemy movements and choose attack timing. These consultants charged substantial fees for reading tarot cards, interpreting crystal balls, and conducting seances with dead generals. Some major offensives were planned around astrological charts and supernatural visions rather than intelligence reports. Military meetings included psychics alongside tactical experts, with mediums given equal voice in strategic decisions. One famous fortune teller convinced French command to attack during a solar eclipse, claiming celestial alignment would guarantee victory. The resulting battle was a complete disaster, but commanders continued consulting psychics throughout the war. French supply logistics included provisions that would scandalize modern military operations. Mobile brothels followed French units to front lines with official military support and protection. These establishments operated under military supervision, with medical officers conducting regular health inspections and commanders setting operating schedules. The brothels traveled in converted trucks and established operations near headquarters positions. Military police provided security and regulated access, treating brothel visits like any other military service. Supply lines included contraceptives, perfumes, and cosmetics alongside ammunition and food. Medical corps allocated significant resources to treating diseases contracted in these establishments, creating a bizarre healthcare specialty within military medicine. The French military chose uniform colors based on psychological theory rather than practical camouflage considerations. Designers selected horizon blue because color experts claimed it looked optimistic and would boost soldier morale. The reasoning was that cheerful-looking troops would fight more aggressively and inspire civilian confidence. Unfortunately, horizon blue stood out dramatically against most battlefield backgrounds, making French soldiers perfect targets for enemy snipers. The color was especially visible against brown mud, green vegetation, and gray concrete, essentially highlighting French positions for German gunners. Military studies showed that horizon blue uniforms increased casualty rates by an estimated 15% compared to more neutral colors. Yet French command refused to change uniform colors because they believed appearance affected fighting spirit more than survival rates. French military discipline statistics reveal the army's brutal approach to maintaining order. France executed 918 soldiers for desertion, the highest rate among major armies during the war. French courts martial operated with minimal legal protection for accused soldiers, often conducting trials that lasted less than an hour. Many executions were carried out within days of alleged offenses, with no appeal process or legal representation. The high execution rate reflected French command's belief that harsh punishment would prevent widespread mutiny, but it actually increased resentment and contributed to the massive French army mutinies of 1917 that nearly collapsed the entire military effort. While French soldiers dealt with wine rations and fortune-telling generals, their German opponents were developing their own peculiar methods of coping with trench warfare. German armies' teddy bears and underground cities. German engineering prowess created underground complexes that transformed trench warfare into something resembling subterranean cities. These elaborate defensive positions extended 30 feet below ground level and included electric lighting systems powered by generators. German soldiers furnished these spaces with tables, chairs, beds, and even artwork salvaged from destroyed buildings. Some underground facilities featured concert halls where military bands performed classical music during bombardments. The largest underground complex near Messines included separate rooms for officers, enlisted men, medical facilities, and ammunition storage. Engineers installed ventilation systems that allowed hundreds of men to live underground for weeks without surfacing. These cities included kitchens with proper stoves, sleeping quarters with individual bunks, and meeting rooms for tactical planning. Some facilities even had libraries stocked with books and newspapers from home. The construction required thousands of hours of labor, with soldiers digging and reinforcing tunnels while battles raged overhead. Stormtrooper training programs pushed German soldiers through exercises that killed more trainees than many actual battles. Training instructors required recruits to practice grenade throwing in confined bunkers using live explosives. These exercises aimed to prepare soldiers for close-quarters trench fighting, but instructors used real grenades in spaces barely large enough for the explosions. Training casualties from premature explosions and mis-thrown grenades reached alarming levels, with some training companies losing 20% of their men before seeing combat. Recruits practiced advancing through narrow trenches while instructors threw live grenades behind them, forcing soldiers to move quickly or face real explosions. The training also included exercises where soldiers had to defuse unexploded grenades under time pressure, resulting in frequent accidents when nervous recruits made mistakes. Medical officers assigned to training facilities treated more severe injuries than many field hospitals, dealing with burns, shrapnel wounds, and hearing loss from training explosions. German military bureaucracy reached obsessive levels that turned record-keeping into an art form. Soldiers maintained detailed logs documenting everything from ammunition consumption to personal hygiene issues. Medical officers required each man to report weekly lice counts, recording exact numbers of parasites found on individual soldiers. These records tracked lice populations across entire units, creating statistical databases that served no apparent military purpose. German clerks documented how many times each soldier wrote letters home, what food items they consumed daily, and even how many hours they spent sleeping. Some units maintained records of soldiers' bathroom habits, tracking frequency and duration of toilet visits. The paperwork requirements became so extensive that some soldiers spent more time writing reports than fighting. Companies employed full-time clerks whose only job involved documenting activities that had no strategic value. German flamethrower experiments produced weapons that posed greater danger to their operators than to enemy soldiers. Early flamethrower designs had a fatal flaw where fuel lines would rupture during operation, covering the operator in burning liquid. German records show that flamethrower units suffered higher casualty rates from equipment malfunctions than from enemy fire. The backpack fuel systems were prone to explosion when hit by bullets or shrapnel, turning operators into human torches. Training with these weapons resulted in numerous accidents where soldiers caught fire during practice sessions. Some flamethrower operators refused to use the weapons after witnessing teammates burn to death from equipment failures. German engineers kept modifying the design, but each improvement created new problems that proved equally deadly. Christmas truces continued throughout the war despite official prohibitions from German command. German soldiers initiated these unofficial ceasefires by singing Christmas carols loud enough for enemy troops to hear. During these truces, soldiers exchanged family photographs, sharing pictures of wives, children, and parents with enemy troops. Some German units prepared small gifts like carved wooden toys or baked goods to trade with British and French soldiers. These exchanges lasted anywhere from a few hours to several days, with soldiers from opposing armies playing football games in no man's land. German officers who discovered these truces faced court-martial proceedings, but soldiers continued organizing them in secret. The practice became so widespread that German command issued specific orders threatening execution for anyone participating in unauthorized truces. German military units officially adopted stray dogs found wandering near battlefields, giving these animals military ranks and ration cards. These war dogs received formal enlistment papers and official identification tags with their assigned ranks and unit numbers. Some dogs achieved promotions based on their service records, with a few reaching the equivalent of sergeant rank. German supply officers allocated food rations for these animals, treating them as legitimate military personnel for logistical purposes. The dogs served various functions, including message delivery, sentry duty, and companionship for isolated soldiers. Military veterinarians provided official medical care for these animals, using supplies and medications intended for human soldiers. Several war dogs received military decorations for distinguished service, with formal ceremonies recognizing their contributions to unit operations. German camouflage efforts included constructing fake trees from steel and concrete that required weeks to install and fooled absolutely no one. These artificial trees were designed to hide observation posts and sniper positions, but they stood out dramatically against natural vegetation. The construction process involved teams of engineers working for days to install single fake trees, making more noise than artillery bombardments. German soldiers complained that these steel trees looked obviously artificial from hundreds of yards away, alerting enemy forces to hidden positions. The fake trees were painted in colors that didn't match surrounding vegetation, and rust stains made them even more conspicuous. Enemy artillery targeted these obvious fake trees specifically, turning them into death traps for German observers. German elastic defense strategy created confusion, so severe that German soldiers regularly shot at their own retreating units. This defensive system involved multiple lines of trenches with planned withdrawals to stronger positions, but soldiers often couldn't distinguish between authorized retreats and enemy breakthroughs. German units fired on their own men who were following orders to fall back to secondary positions. After the Marne, Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke allegedly told Kaiser Wilhelm, "Magstatt wir haben den Krieg verloren," signaling the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and the beginning of Germany's strategic difficulties. By late 1914, supply shortages due to economic collapse forced German soldiers to scavenge equipment from both friend and foe. The situation became so desperate that German trenches became more appealing than advancing into combat, with soldiers refusing orders to leave their comfortable underground positions. While German engineering created impressive defensive systems, their eastern allies faced even more catastrophic Russian army's barefoot marches and mystical madness. The Russian army's logistical failures reached levels that transformed basic military operations into survival ordeals. Russian soldiers marched hundreds of miles without boots, a reality that sounds impossible but happened regularly throughout the war. The Russian army simply couldn't supply footwear to its massive forces, leaving entire regiments to trek across frozen ground barefoot. These marches weren't short distances either. Soldiers walked from training camps to front lines, covering 300 to 500 miles with nothing protecting their feet except strips of cloth when they could find them. Some men wrapped their feet in paper from letters home, while others used pieces of their uniforms as makeshift protection. The Russian supply system prioritized ammunition and food over basic clothing, meaning boots ranked as luxury items rather than essential equipment. Medical officers reported that some 1.8 million Russian troops suffered frostbite during the war, with infected foot wounds disabling more soldiers than enemy bullets during winter campaigns. Entire battalions arrived at battle positions with half their men unable to walk properly due to foot injuries sustained during these brutal marches. The collapse of traditional military order led Russian soldiers to embrace mysticism and superstition as coping mechanisms for unprecedented losses. Spiritualism rose dramatically as soldiers sought comfort from the constant death surrounding them, with entire units conducting seances to communicate with fallen comrades. Russian trenches became centers of supernatural activity, where soldiers claimed to receive messages from dead relatives guiding them through battles. Orthodox priests found themselves overwhelmed by requests for protective charms, blessed medallions, and religious ceremonies that promised divine protection from bullets and shells. Some Russian units refused to attack without elaborate blessing rituals that could last for hours, treating spiritual preparation as more important than tactical planning. Equipment shortages reached levels that turned Russian soldiers into scavengers during active combat. Officers regularly instructed their men to collect rifles from fallen comrades rather than expecting proper weapon supplies from military stores. This meant Russian soldiers entered battles knowing they might need to crawl across corpse-filled battlefields to find functioning firearms. Some men went into combat completely unarmed, waiting for casualties to provide them with weapons. The practice created a grotesque economy where Russian soldiers competed for rifles from their own dead teammates. Ammunition shortages compounded this problem, with soldiers limited to specific numbers of bullets regardless of combat duration. Some Russian units received 10 rounds per man for battles that lasted days, forcing extreme conservation of ammunition. Russian military experiments with specially distilled alcohol produced a substance called battle vodka that caused more problems than it solved. Military chemists created this enhanced alcohol believing it would eliminate fear and increase soldier aggression during combat. The battle vodka contained nearly twice the alcohol content of regular vodka, plus added stimulants that were supposed to boost courage and energy levels. Russian commanders distributed this substance before major attacks, expecting their men to charge enemy positions with chemically enhanced bravery. Instead, most soldiers became severely intoxicated and unable to follow basic commands or handle weapons safely. Some units became so drunk they fired on their own positions or wandered away from battlefields entirely. Medical officers reported numerous cases of alcohol poisoning from battle vodka consumption, with some soldiers requiring emergency treatment before seeing any combat. Orthodox priests conducted elaborate weapon blessing ceremonies that treated artillery shells like religious artifacts requiring divine intervention. These rituals involved priests sprinkling holy water on rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces while reciting prayers for divine protection and victory. The ceremonies for artillery shells were particularly elaborate, with priests performing full baptism rituals on explosive devices. Soldiers lined up with their weapons for individual blessings, creating long ceremonial processions that lasted hours. Some units spent entire days on weapon blessing ceremonies rather than training or preparing defensive positions. Russian soldiers believed blessed weapons would fire more accurately and cause greater damage to enemy forces. Russian commanders employed professional astrologers to determine optimal timing for military offensives, scheduling major attacks based on celestial events rather than strategic considerations. These astrologers analyzed star charts, planetary alignments, and lunar phases to identify supposedly favorable conditions for military operations. Russian attacks were delayed or accelerated depending on astrological predictions about cosmic influences on battlefield outcomes. This practice led to offensives launched during terrible weather conditions because astrologers claimed celestial alignments overrode environmental factors. Some Russian attacks began during blizzards or heavy rains simply because astrologers reported favorable star positions. The Russian supply system operated more like medieval foraging armies than modern military organizations, expecting soldiers to find their own food in war-torn territories. Russian troops received irregular supply deliveries and were instructed to supplement their rations by scavenging from abandoned farms and destroyed villages. This foraging system worked poorly in areas where previous armies had already stripped away available food sources. Russian soldiers competed with local civilian populations for whatever edible materials remained in devastated regions. Some units spent more time searching for food than fighting enemy forces, with soldiers dispersing across wide areas to hunt for sustenance. Russian winter uniforms demonstrated catastrophic planning failures that made soldiers more visible rather than providing camouflage protection. These white uniforms were designed to blend with snow-covered landscapes, but they turned bright yellow after a single washing due to poor quality materials and inadequate dyes. The yellowed uniforms stood out dramatically against white snow, making Russian soldiers perfect targets for enemy snipers and machine gunners. The Russian Medical Corps operated with staffing levels that guaranteed most wounded soldiers would die without receiving professional medical attention. Russian forces had only one trained surgeon for every 10,000 men, meaning that battlefield casualties faced overwhelming odds against survival. Most Russian soldiers injured during combat never saw a doctor, relying instead on basic first aid from fellow soldiers who lacked medical training. While the Russian army struggled with supply failures and mystical decision-making, their Austro-Hungarian allies faced an entirely different set of problems that would make Russian logistics look straightforward by comparison. Austro-Hungarian army's language chaos and ethnic paranoia. The Austro-Hungarian army faced a communication nightmare that sounds like a cruel joke played by geography and history. Individual military units contained soldiers speaking up to 11 different languages, including German, Hungarian, Czech, Polish, Croatian, Serbian, Romanian, Italian, Slovak, Slovene, and Ukrainian. Officers attempting to give basic commands like advance or retreat found themselves addressing men who literally could not understand what they were being told. A single company might include German-speaking Austrians, Hungarian cavalrymen, Czech infantry, and Polish artillery specialists, none of whom shared a common language for military communication. Company commanders often spoke only 2 or 3 languages themselves, leaving them unable to communicate with large portions of their own units. Simple orders that took seconds to deliver in other armies required complex translation chains that lasted minutes, if they worked at all. Military planners developed an elaborate system of hand signals and pictorial drawings to overcome language barriers, but these solutions created worse problems than the original communication issues. Officers drew pictures of tactical movements and battle plans, hoping soldiers would interpret sketches correctly during combat situations. Hand signals worked reasonably well during training exercises, but failed catastrophically when battle conditions included smoke, darkness, and artillery bombardments that made visual communication impossible. Some units developed their own unique gesture systems, meaning soldiers transferred between companies had to learn entirely new signal vocabularies. The pictorial order system led to disasters when soldiers misinterpreted drawings or when artistic abilities varied dramatically between commanding officers. Several documented battles failed because soldiers received contradictory visual orders or simply couldn't see hand signals through battlefield conditions. Ethnic paranoia infected the officer corps to such a degree that commanders regularly suspected their own soldiers of treason based purely on linguistic differences and regional accents. Officers from German and Hungarian backgrounds viewed Slavic soldiers with constant suspicion, believing that Czech, Serbian, or Polish troops would desert to enemy forces at the first opportunity. This suspicion extended to ridiculous extremes where soldiers speaking their native languages during off-duty hours faced accusations of plotting rebellion or communicating with enemy agents. Some commanders prohibited soldiers from speaking anything except German, even among themselves, creating an atmosphere of fear and resentment that destroyed unit cohesion. Military intelligence officers spent more time spying on their own troops than gathering information about enemy positions, filing reports about suspicious conversations overheard in barracks rather than focusing on tactical intelligence. Mixed ethnicity firing squads executed soldiers for alleged disloyalty in scenes that epitomize the Army's internal dysfunction. These execution details included German soldiers shooting Czech prisoners, Hungarian guards executing Serbian troops, and Polish riflemen killing Romanian deserters, often without any shared language for final communications. The condemned soldiers frequently had no idea what charges they faced because court-martial proceedings were conducted in languages they didn't understand. Some executions proceeded without translators present, meaning accused men died without comprehending their alleged crimes or having opportunities to defend themselves. Military records show numerous cases where soldiers were executed for desertion when they had simply become separated from their units due to language confusion during complex troop movements. Austro-Hungarian military engineers developed universal military symbols intended to transcend language barriers, but these pictographic systems proved more confusing than helpful. The symbol system included hundreds of different icons representing everything from troop movements to supply requests, requiring soldiers to memorize complex visual vocabularies that changed frequently as commanders added new symbols. Different units often used conflicting symbol systems, meaning reinforcements arriving from other sectors couldn't interpret local military communications. The symbols themselves were poorly designed, with similar-looking icons representing completely different concepts that led to catastrophic mix-ups during battle planning. Some symbols were so abstract that even officers who designed them forgot their meanings within weeks of implementation. Soldiers throughout the Army developed the grim practice of writing wills in multiple languages because nobody knew which ethnic group would discover their bodies after battles. These multilingual testaments reflected soldiers' awareness that their final messages might need translation by Czech medics, Hungarian burial details, or German graves registration units. Some wills included up to 5 different language versions of the same message, with soldiers spending precious off-duty time ensuring their final wishes could be understood regardless of who found them. The practice also reflected deep uncertainty about unit composition, as soldiers couldn't predict which ethnic groups would survive battles to handle casualty processing and body identification. Military headquarters employed children as young as 12 years old as official translators for crucial battle communications, placing enormous responsibility on youngsters who barely understood military terminology in any language. These child translators handled orders between high-ranking officers and field commanders, meaning strategic decisions depended on pre-adolescent linguistic abilities. Some children worked 16-hour shifts translating complex tactical documents and urgent battlefield communications, while adults fought and died based on their interpretation accuracy. The practice created dangerous situations where military strategy depended on children's understanding of adult concepts like artillery coordinates, troop movements, and supply logistics. Several documented cases exist where translation errors by child interpreters led to friendly fire incidents or misdirected attacks. The uniform system created additional chaos by assigning completely different colors and styles to various ethnic units, making battlefield identification nearly impossible during combat conditions. German units wore standard gray uniforms while Hungarian troops dressed in distinctive bright colors that made them visible targets. Czech units received blue uniforms that resembled French military clothing, leading to confusion about unit identity during battles. Some ethnic regiments wore traditional regional clothing adapted for military use, creating a rainbow effect that destroyed any pretense of military uniformity or tactical camouflage. Soldiers often couldn't distinguish between friendly and enemy forces when units from different ethnic backgrounds fought in the same areas. Religious services presented logistical nightmares as military chaplains attempted to provide spiritual support for Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim, and Jewish soldiers simultaneously. Base camps required multiple religious facilities and competing worship schedules that conflicted with military training and operational requirements. Catholic masses, Orthodox liturgies, Islamic prayers, and Jewish services all demanded different ceremonial supplies, dietary, accommodations, and burial practices that strained already overwhelmed supply systems. Some military units spent more resources on religious accommodation than on ammunition or medical supplies, with chaplains receiving priority transport space over essential military equipment. The combination of language barriers, ethnic tensions, and cultural conflicts produced the highest desertion rate of any major army during World War I. Entire companies abandoned their positions rather than continue fighting alongside soldiers they couldn't communicate with under officers they didn't trust. Some units dissolved completely when soldiers simply walked away from battles, returning to their home regions rather than continuing military service. Desertion reached such epidemic proportions that some sectors of the front lines became completely unmanned as Austro-Hungarian forces evaporated through mass abandonment. Military police spent more time hunting deserters than supporting combat operations, creating a vicious cycle where enforcement efforts further alienated remaining soldiers and encouraged additional desertions. While communication failures and ethnic tensions crippled the Austro-Hungarian military effort, all armies faced another category of problems that proved equally devastating. The weapons and equipment that soldiers depended on for survival often became instruments of destruction in ways their designers never intended. The most bizarre equipment failures that changed history. Equipment malfunctions transformed cutting-edge military technology into death traps that killed more soldiers than enemy bullets. British tanks launched their revolutionary debut with crews who literally forgot to bring operating instructions. During the first major tank deployment at Flers-Courcelette in September 1916, several Mark I tanks became completely immobilized not because of enemy fire, but because their crews had no idea how to operate the steering systems. Tank commanders received their 28-ton vehicles without manuals, diagrams, or basic training on the complex steering mechanism that required multiple operators working in coordination. Some tanks drove in straight lines until they crashed into obstacles, while others spun helplessly in circles as confused crews struggled with controls they didn't understand. These expensive metal beasts became stationary targets, achieving the remarkable feat of being more dangerous to their own operators than to German forces. The tanks that managed to move often became trapped in shell craters because drivers had no training in obstacle navigation. French flamethrower disasters turned operators into human torches with terrifying regularity. The Gross Flammenwerfer carried enough burning liquid to incinerate its user within seconds when a volatile system malfunctioned. A simple bump could trigger explosions that transformed operators into walking infernos, while fuel line ruptures covered crews in ignited petroleum during combat operations. French records document training exercises where flamethrower operators burst into flames, creating such terror that entire units refused to use the weapons. The devices were so unstable that enemy bullets hitting the fuel tanks turned operators into bombs that endangered nearby infantry. Some units reported more casualties from flamethrower malfunctions than from successful attacks against German positions. German gas masks became death traps in summer heat when rubber and fabric materials literally melted against soldiers' faces. When temperatures exceeded 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the masks would dissolve into toxic substances that poisoned wearers more severely than the enemy gases they were designed to filter. The melting process sealed masks to soldiers' skin, requiring painful removal procedures that caused permanent scarring and chemical burns. German troops in hot climates often chose to risk enemy gas exposure rather than wear protective equipment that might kill them faster than the chemicals it was meant to block. Russian artillery units discovered that factory sabotage had filled thousands of shells with sand instead of explosives. Workers opposed to the war systematically replaced explosive charges with sand, creating ammunition that looked normal but contained zero destructive capability. Russian bombardments used thousands of these sabotage shells, producing the sound and smoke of effective artillery attacks while causing no damage to German fortifications. Artillery officers couldn't distinguish between legitimate shells and sand-filled duds, meaning they planned major offensives based on artillery support that simply didn't exist. This industrial rebellion crippled Russian offensive capabilities and contributed directly to catastrophic military defeats. Austro-Hungarian machine guns jammed so frequently that soldiers used the expensive precision weapons as clubs during hand-to-hand combat. The Schwarzlos machine gun's cooling system failed in dusty conditions, causing weapons to seize after firing fewer than 50 rounds. Machine gun crews discovered their automatic firearms were more effective as blunt instruments than as shooting weapons, leading to the bizarre practice of converting sophisticated military equipment into primitive clubs. Some units removed barrels from jammed weapons to create better melee weapons, essentially turning machine gun positions into liability rather than assets during crucial battle moments. British aircraft manufacturing used water-soluble glue instead of waterproof adhesives, causing planes to dissolve mid-flight when exposed to rain or humidity. Pilots reported wings detaching from fuselages and control surfaces, failing as glue joints dissolved during flight operations. Some aircraft disintegrated so gradually that pilots realized their planes were falling apart before crashing to their deaths. The incorrect adhesive meant that aircraft stored outdoors became unusable after rainstorms, creating maintenance disasters where functional planes turned into scrap metal from weather exposure. French grenades featured chemical fuses so unpredictable they exploded anywhere from 2 to 20 seconds after activation. The timing varied wildly based on temperature, humidity, and manufacturing quality, creating weapons that might detonate immediately in soldiers' hands or fail to explode when thrown at enemy positions. French troops had no way to predict detonation timing, leading to more casualties from their own grenades than from German weapons. Some units abandoned grenade use entirely after experiencing repeated friendly fire incidents. German submarines suffered ballast tank failures that caused uncontrollable surfacing during combat operations. U-boats would emerge unexpectedly in enemy shipping lanes, transforming underwater vessels into sitting ducks for Allied destroyers and aircraft. The mechanical failures meant submarines couldn't maintain depth control, making them visible targets that could be easily destroyed with deck guns or depth charges. Some submarines surfaced so suddenly that crews had no time to prepare for surface combat. Russian rifles manufactured with reversed firing mechanisms killed soldiers attempting to use them. These weapons fired backwards when triggers were pulled, sending bullets into Russian soldiers' faces rather than toward German positions. The defect affected thousands of rifles, but poor quality control meant defective weapons reached frontline units without detection. Soldiers learned to test rifles by firing into the ground, but many discovered the fatal flaw only when attempting to shoot at enemy forces. Equipment failures killed an estimated 200,000 soldiers during the war, often occurring at crucial moments when reliable technology could have changed battle outcomes. These mechanical disasters transformed potential victories into devastating defeats through simple engineering incompetence. But equipment failures represented only the beginning of military experimentation gone wrong, as armies across Europe pursued increasingly desperate and secret military experiments that went horribly wrong. Military laboratories became testing grounds for experiments that defied both logic and basic safety protocols. British military scientists believed they could solve the problem of missile guidance by training pigeons to direct projectiles toward enemy targets. This project involved placing pigeons inside missile nose cones with specially designed control systems that the birds could operate by pecking at targets displayed on screens. The theory suggested that pigeons' natural homing abilities and visual acuity would make them perfect biological guidance systems for weapons that needed to hit specific targets from long distances. Military researchers spent months conditioning pigeons to recognize enemy aircraft, ships, and ground installations through elaborate training programs that rewarded birds for correctly identifying target photographs. The pigeons learned their lessons well during controlled laboratory conditions, successfully pecking at images of German submarines and aircraft with remarkable consistency. However, the pigeon guidance system collapsed completely when tested under realistic combat conditions. The birds proved utterly incapable of distinguishing between friendly and enemy targets when faced with actual battlefield scenarios rather than controlled photographs. Pigeons trained to attack German aircraft would peck frantically at British planes, American bombers, and even their own transport vehicles with equal enthusiasm. The birds became confused by smoke, weather conditions, and the general chaos of combat, leading them to direct missiles toward random targets that included Allied ships, friendly ground positions, and civilian structures. Some test missiles guided by pigeons ended up flying in circles because the birds couldn't decide which of multiple targets deserved their attention. The project consumed enormous resources before military officials finally admitted that pigeons lacked the cognitive ability to make complex battlefield decisions. Soviet military commanders developed an ambitious plan to train dogs as anti-tank weapons, strapping explosives to the animals and teaching them to run beneath enemy vehicles. This program involved conditioning hundreds of dogs to associate food with the undersides of tanks, creating Pavlovian responses that would theoretically drive the animals toward German armor during battles. Soviet trainers believed that dogs' speed and small size would allow them to penetrate enemy lines and deliver devastating explosives directly to tank vulnerable points. The dogs learned to follow tank engine sounds and seek shelter beneath large vehicles during training exercises conducted with Soviet equipment. The anti-tank dog program ended in catastrophe when the animals consistently attacked Soviet vehicles instead of German targets. Dogs trained on Soviet tanks naturally sought familiar diesel fuel scents and engine sounds, leading them to run toward their own forces rather than enemy armor. The animals became confused and terrified during actual combat, often detonating their explosive charges prematurely or running back toward their handlers for protection. Several Soviet tank crews were killed when their own anti-tank dogs exploded beneath friendly vehicles, and many animals simply fled battlefields rather than following their training. Some dogs actually began following German tanks, but proved too frightened to approach close enough for their explosives to cause meaningful damage. French military researchers developed a specialized cologne called battle perfume that was supposed to mask the natural scent of fear that soldiers produced during combat situations. Scientists believe that eliminating fear-related odors would boost soldier confidence and prevent enemy forces from detecting French positions through smell. The perfume contained powerful chemical compounds designed to overwhelm human scent receptors and create an artificial aromatic barrier around French troops. Military chemists spent months perfecting the formula, testing different scent combinations on volunteer soldiers to determine which fragrances most effectively concealed natural human odors. The battle perfume project backfired spectacularly when field tests revealed that the artificial scents actually attracted enemy attention rather than concealing French positions. German soldiers quickly learned to identify the distinctive perfume smell and used it to locate French troops hiding in trenches or preparing surprise attacks. The perfume was so potent that it could be detected from hundreds of yards away, essentially marking French positions for enemy artillery and sniper fire. Some German units began tracking French movements by following perfume trails left behind by troops who had applied the scent before operations. The perfume also caused allergic reactions among French soldiers, creating medical problems that reduced combat effectiveness and required treatment resources. British scientists developed the Panjandrum, a rocket-propelled wheeled device filled with explosives and intended for use against beach defenses. This bizarre weapon consisted of two large wheels connected by a central drum packed with explosives, with rockets attached around the wheel rims to provide propulsion. Military engineers believed the device would roll across beaches and detonate against German fortifications, clearing paths for Allied landing forces. During development, the Panjandrum showed promise in controlled tests where it successfully rolled in straight lines and maintained stable trajectories. The Panjandrum project failed because the rockets frequently malfunctioned or detached during operation, causing the device to veer wildly off course. Test runs saw the weapon spinning uncontrollably, rolling backward toward British positions, or simply falling apart as rockets fired in random directions. The device proved impossible to aim accurately, with some test runs ending when the Panjandrum rolled into the ocean or exploded prematurely. Engineers attempted numerous modifications, but each design change created new problems that made the weapon even more unpredictable and dangerous to operate. German military engineers attempted to develop the wind cannon, an anti-aircraft weapon that fired compressed air jets to damage low-flying aircraft. This device used explosive charges to create powerful air blasts that theoretically could knock planes out of the sky without requiring direct hits from conventional ammunition. Military scientists believe that air pressure waves would be more effective than bullets or shells for destroying fast-moving aircraft. The wind cannon showed some promise during initial testing against stationary targets and slow-moving aircraft. The wind cannon proved completely ineffective against actual combat aircraft and posed significant dangers to German operators. The device required enormous amounts of explosive material to generate sufficient air pressure, making it expensive and dangerous to operate. Test results showed that the air blasts dissipated too quickly to affect aircraft flying at normal combat speeds and altitudes. The weapon also created massive noise and visible effects that revealed German positions to enemy forces, making it more valuable as a target marker than as an anti-aircraft system. These experimental programs consumed resources equivalent to equipping and maintaining several complete military divisions while producing no beneficial results for any participating army. The failures demonstrated that desperation often led military planners to pursue impossible solutions rather than addressing fundamental tactical problems. But while official experiments failed spectacularly, individual soldiers were developing their own unofficial methods for surviving the impossible conditions of trench warfare. The strangest survival tactics soldiers actually used. Soldiers discovered that playing dead could keep them alive for days, but the survival requirements made this tactic almost as dangerous as active combat. Men would lie motionless among corpses for 48 to 72 hours, waiting for darkness or enemy withdrawal before attempting to return to their lines. During these extended death performances, soldiers survived by eating insects they could catch without moving and drinking rainwater that collected in shell craters or helmet indentations. Some men lay still while rats crawled over their bodies and maggots began forming on nearby corpses, requiring incredible mental discipline to avoid flinching or making noise. The technique demanded perfect timing because moving too early meant certain death from enemy snipers, while waiting too long risked actual death from dehydration or exposure. Soldiers who successfully used this tactic reported that the psychological trauma of lying among rotting bodies often proved worse than the physical discomfort of hunger and thirst. The practice of using corpses as human shields became a grim necessity that violated every principle of military honor and human decency. Soldiers would drag dead bodies into positions that provided cover from machine gun fire or sniper attacks, arranging fallen comrades and enemies alike into protective barriers. This technique proved particularly valuable in no man's land, where any form of cover could mean the difference between life and death. Some soldiers became expert at positioning bodies to create maximum protection while maintaining mobility for quick movements between positions. The practice required soldiers to overcome natural revulsion toward handling decomposing corpses, with many men developing elaborate mental techniques to distance themselves emotionally from what they were doing. Medical officers reported that soldiers who regularly used corpse shields showed higher rates of psychological breakdown, but the immediate survival benefits made the practice widespread despite its horrific nature. Communication through fake bird calls seemed like a clever solution to the problem of maintaining contact without alerting enemy forces, but this technique attracted dangers that soldiers hadn't anticipated. Troops developed elaborate systems of whistles and calls that mimicked local bird species, creating codes for different messages about enemy movements, supply needs, and tactical coordination. The system worked reasonably well during quiet periods when soldiers could practice and refine their imitations. However, the artificial bird calls often attracted real predators that viewed the sounds as territorial challenges or mating opportunities. Soldiers attempting covert communication found themselves surrounded by aggressive birds defending their territory, creating noise and movement that revealed their positions to enemy observers. Deliberate self-infection with minor diseases became a desperate strategy for soldiers seeking temporary escape from frontline combat duties. Men would intentionally expose themselves to ailments like dysentery, skin infections, or respiratory problems that were serious enough to require medical attention but not severe enough to cause permanent disability. Some soldiers shared contaminated food or water with comrades who wanted to become sick, creating informal networks for spreading manageable illnesses. Others would deliberately worsen minor cuts or scrapes to create infections that justified medical evacuation. This practice required careful calculation because soldiers needed illnesses that would remove them from combat without causing lasting harm to their health or military careers. Medical officers eventually learned to recognize patterns of suspicious illness outbreaks and began investigating cases where multiple soldiers from the same unit developed similar symptoms simultaneously. Tunnel warfare evolved into an underground existence where soldiers lived like moles for months at a time, creating elaborate subterranean communities beneath battlefield surfaces. These tunnel networks extended for miles in some sectors, with soldiers excavating living spaces, storage areas, and communication passages that connected different sections of the front lines. Men spent entire deployments underground, emerging only for specific missions or supply runs under cover of darkness. The tunnel systems included sleeping quarters carved into earth walls, underground kitchens where soldiers prepared meals using portable stoves, and even recreational areas where men played cards or wrote letters home. Some tunnel complexes became so extensive that soldiers could travel between distant positions without ever appearing above ground. Life in these tunnels created unique health problems, including lung diseases from poor air quality, vitamin deficiencies from lack of sunlight, and psychological issues related to prolonged confinement in dark, cramped spaces. Trading with enemy soldiers during unofficial truces created bizarre marketplace situations where men exchanged essential supplies across battle lines. These transactions involved complex negotiations where soldiers traded food rations for ammunition, tobacco for medical supplies, or warm clothing for tools and equipment. The exchanges required elaborate security measures to prevent officers from discovering these unauthorized activities, with soldiers developing hand signals and meeting protocols for conducting business with their supposed enemies. Some trading relationships lasted for months, with regular exchange schedules that both sides honored despite ongoing combat operations. The practice revealed how survival needs often trumped military loyalty, as soldiers prioritized immediate necessities over abstract concepts of national duty. Creating fake injuries using theatrical makeup and animal blood became an art form among soldiers desperate for medical leave from combat zones. Men learned to simulate wounds that appeared serious enough to justify evacuation, but not so severe that medical examination would reveal the deception. The technique required careful preparation, including obtaining animal blood from field kitchens, creating realistic wound patterns using available materials, and practicing injury symptoms that would convince medical personnel. Some soldiers became expert at mimicking symptoms of internal injuries or psychological trauma that couldn't be easily verified through physical examination. Using mirrors to blind enemy snipers created tactical advantages that often came with deadly consequences for the soldiers employing this technique. Troops would position small mirrors or reflective metal pieces to direct sunlight into sniper scopes, temporarily disabling enemy marksmen during crucial moments. However, the mirrors also revealed the exact positions of soldiers using them, making the technique a double-edged survival tool. Enemy forces learned to watch for light reflections and would direct immediate fire toward any position showing mirror activity. Training rats to carry messages created underground postal systems that function more reliably than traditional communication methods in trench environments. Soldiers caught wild rats and taught them to navigate tunnel networks between different positions, carrying small message containers attached to their bodies. These rodent messengers could travel through spaces too small or dangerous for human couriers, delivering communications that might otherwise be impossible to transmit. The rats learned to recognize specific locations and could complete message runs even during artillery bombardments that prevented other forms of communication. These improvised survival tactics succeeded where official military strategies failed because they addressed immediate practical needs rather than abstract strategic objectives. Yet even as soldiers developed these desperate methods for staying alive, they somehow found ways to maintain the cultural traditions and customs that reminded them of home and humanity. Cultural practices that defied military logic. British soldiers maintained their afternoon tea tradition with such dedication that they continued the practice during active artillery bombardments, creating scenes that seemed pulled from absurdist theater rather than military operations. Tommy soldiers would brew tea in their trenches while German shells exploded overhead, carefully following proper tea preparation rituals that included warming the pot, steeping leaves for precise durations, and serving in whatever cups or makeshift containers they could find. These tea ceremonies occurred at scheduled times regardless of battlefield conditions, with soldiers taking cover between sips when shrapnel flew too close. Some units appointed official tea stewards who maintained supplies and equipment specifically for these daily rituals, treating tea preparation as seriously as weapon maintenance. The practice provided psychological anchoring to home life and British identity, creating moments of normalcy that helped soldiers cope with constant death threats. German soldiers celebrated birthdays with elaborate ceremonies that included full military honors and cake deliveries to frontline positions, transforming war zones into impromptu party venues. Birthday celebrations featured formal presentations where commanding officers delivered speeches honoring the celebrating soldier, while comrades sang traditional German songs and presented handmade gifts crafted from battlefield materials. These events required extensive planning and resource allocation, with units organizing special food deliveries that included actual birthday cakes transported from rear areas to forward trenches. Some celebrations lasted entire days, with off-duty soldiers participating in games, music performances, and storytelling sessions centered around the birthday soldier. The German military postal service prioritized birthday packages from home, ensuring that celebrating soldiers received family gifts and letters even during intense combat periods. French soldiers developed an artistic tradition of writing poetry directly onto artillery shells, transforming instruments of destruction into literary weapons that carried verses into battle. This practice involved soldiers carefully inscribing poems, song lyrics, and personal messages onto shell casings using knives, nails, or improvised engraving tools during quiet periods between battles. The poetry ranged from patriotic verses celebrating France to deeply personal reflections about love, loss, and longing for home. Some shells carried entire romantic sonnets intended for specific lovers, while others featured political messages or humorous observations about military life. Artillery crews took pride in firing these literary projectiles, believing that poems added spiritual power to their weapons and increased accuracy against enemy targets. Russian Orthodox soldiers participated in elaborate rifle blessing ceremonies before every major battle, creating religious rituals that lasted several hours and involved hundreds of participants. These ceremonies required Orthodox priests to travel to frontline positions carrying holy water, religious icons, and ceremonial equipment needed for weapons sanctification rituals. Each soldier presented his rifle individually for blessing, while priests recited prayers, sprinkled holy water on weapons, and performed sign of the cross gestures over firearms and ammunition. The ceremonies included group prayers, hymn singing, and readings from religious texts that soldiers believed would provide divine protection during combat. Some blessing rituals involved anointing rifle barrels with sacred oils and attaching small religious medallions to weapon stocks. Austro-Hungarian soldiers overcame language barriers by teaching each other traditional folk dances from their various home regions during rest periods, creating multicultural entertainment that fostered unity among ethnically diverse units. These dance sessions involved soldiers from different ethnic backgrounds demonstrating Hungarian waltzes, Czech polkas, Polish mazurkas, and Croatian folk dances to comrades who spoke completely different languages. The teaching process relied entirely on physical demonstration and musical rhythm, allowing communication through movement rather than words. Some units organized formal dance competitions where soldiers performed dances from their homelands, while others judged performances and awarded prizes made from battlefield materials. British soldiers regularly adopted pets found in abandoned enemy trenches, creating situations where armies cared for cats and dogs that had previously belonged to opposing forces. These cross-lines pet adoptions occurred when British units captured German positions and discovered animals left behind during retreats or battles. Soldiers would immediately claim these pets as unit mascots, providing food, shelter, and medical care regardless of the animal's previous allegiances. Some pets switched sides multiple times as trenches changed hands, with soldiers on both sides treating the same animals as beloved companions. These adopted pets received official unit designations and ration allocations, with military supply officers including pet food and requisition orders alongside ammunition and medical supplies. German soldiers transformed their trenches into underground art galleries by carving elaborate sculptures and murals directly into earth walls, creating artistic installations that rivaled professional museum exhibits. These artistic projects involved soldiers using knives, bayonets, and improvised tools to carve detailed relief sculptures depicting everything from religious scenes to portraits of family members. Some trench art installations covered entire wall sections with intricate designs that took weeks or months to complete, requiring multiple soldiers working in shifts during off-duty periods. The artwork included three-dimensional sculptures carved from trench support beams, decorative panels featuring geometric patterns, and portrait galleries showing fallen comrades and loved ones back home. French soldiers established pen-pal relationships with enemy soldiers by writing letters that were exchanged during unofficial truces, creating personal connections that transcended national boundaries and military conflicts. These correspondence relationships involved French and German soldiers sharing personal stories, family photographs, and philosophical reflections about war experiences through letters written in broken combinations of French, German, and English. The letters discussed everything from home life and family concerns to shared observations about military incompetence and war's absurdity. Some pen-pal relationships lasted months, with soldiers coordinating letter exchanges through informal agreements about specific locations and times for mail drops in no man's land. Russian soldiers practiced sharing personal belongings with deceased comrades, believing this ritual would transfer good luck from the dead to the living and provide spiritual protection during future battles. This practice involved placing personal items like photographs, jewelry, or religious artifacts alongside fallen soldiers before burial, then retrieving different items that had belonged to the deceased. These exchanges created spiritual connections between living and dead soldiers while redistributing valuable personal possessions among survivors who needed comfort items or practical tools. These cultural traditions succeeded where military regulations failed because they addressed fundamental human needs for connection, meaning, and identity that no amount of official programming could satisfy. Yet while soldiers found creative ways to maintain their humanity through cultural practices, the military bureaucracy responsible for keeping them supplied, fed, and equipped was developing problems that logistical nightmares that sound like comedy sketches. Military supply chains during World War I produced logistical disasters so absurd they sound like scripts from comedy shows rather than actual wartime operations. The British Army managed to achieve the remarkable feat of delivering winter coats to soldiers sweating through summer heat while simultaneously shipping shorts and lightweight uniforms to troops freezing in winter trenches. These weren't isolated incidents but systematic failures that plagued British supply operations throughout the war. Soldiers received heavy wool overcoats during July and August when temperatures reached 90 degrees, while December brought deliveries of tropical uniforms designed for colonial service in hot climates. The timing couldn't have been worse, with winter coat deliveries often arriving just as summer heat waves peaked and lightweight clothing shipments reaching front lines during the coldest months of the year. Supply officers seem to operate on reverse seasonal logic, consistently delivering exactly the wrong equipment at precisely the wrong time. French logistical operations achieved their own special brand of chaos by consistently delivering supplies to completely wrong destinations throughout the war. Artillery units desperate for shells and explosives instead received shipments of flour, vegetables, and cooking equipment that belonged in field kitchens miles away from gun positions. Meanwhile, kitchen staff expecting food deliveries opened supply crates filled with artillery shells, rifle ammunition, and explosive devices that had no place near cooking facilities. These mix-ups created dangerous situations where cooks handled live ammunition while artillery crews tried to feed themselves with uncooked ingredients they had no ability to prepare. Some artillery positions accumulated tons of food supplies they couldn't use while field kitchens received enough ammunition to supply entire battalions. The confusion reached such levels that artillery officers learned basic cooking techniques while kitchen staff became experts at identifying different types of shells and explosives. German supply confusion created equally bizarre situations where medical supplies intended for field hospitals ended up in mechanical repair shops while engine parts and automotive equipment arrived at medical facilities. Surgeons found themselves staring at crates filled with spark plugs, transmission gears, and motor oil when they desperately needed bandages, surgical instruments, and medical supplies. Simultaneously, mechanics trying to repair vehicles and maintain equipment received shipments of morphine, surgical tools, and medical gauze that served no purpose in motor pools. These supply mix-ups forced medical personnel to improvise treatments using automotive supplies, while mechanics attempted to repair engines with surgical instruments. Some field hospitals accumulated warehouses full of mechanical parts while repair shops overflowed with medical equipment nobody knew how to use. Russian supply operations managed to create one of the war's most ridiculous logistical disasters by consistently delivering only left boots to military units throughout multiple campaigns. Entire battalions received shipments containing hundreds of left boots with no corresponding right footwear, creating armies of soldiers who limped across battlefields wearing mismatched footwear or single boots on alternate feet. This wasn't a one-time mistake, but a persistent problem that affected Russian forces for months, suggesting systematic failures in supply chain coordination that boggled the mind. Some soldiers learned to walk exclusively on their left feet, while others developed elaborate rotation systems for sharing the few right boots available within their units. The situation created medical problems as soldiers developed foot injuries, leg muscle imbalances, and walking difficulties that reduced their combat effectiveness and required treatment from already overwhelmed medical staff. Austro-Hungarian logistical chaos reflected the empire's linguistic diversity in the worst possible ways, with Hungarian units consistently receiving instruction manuals written in Czech, while Czech soldiers receive Hungarian language documentation they couldn't understand. These language mix-ups meant that soldiers couldn't read basic operating instructions for equipment, weapon maintenance procedures, or tactical guidelines essential for military operations. Hungarian troops stared helplessly at Czech technical manuals, while Czech soldiers puzzled over Hungarian equipment guides, creating situations where nobody understood how to operate essential military hardware. The language confusion extended to supply requisitions, maintenance schedules, and tactical communications that required translation services the military couldn't provide. British postal operations added their own tragic comedy to wartime logistics by delivering Christmas presents to soldiers who had died months earlier. These packages arrived at frontline positions addressed to men whose deaths had been reported weeks or months before the gifts reached their destinations. Living soldiers faced the heartbreaking task of handling Christmas presents intended for fallen comrades, creating emotional situations that compounded the psychological stress of combat operations. The postal system seemed incapable of updating delivery lists to reflect battlefield casualties, resulting in continuous deliveries of personal packages, letters, and gifts to deceased recipients. French supply lines achieved legendary status for accidentally delivering 10,000 baguettes to a single unit of 100 men, creating bread mountains that towered over trenches like edible monuments to logistical incompetence. This massive bread delivery arrived all at once, overwhelming the small unit with enough baked goods to feed a division for several days. The soldiers faced the impossible task of consuming or storing thousands of loaves before they spoiled, leading to bread trading networks with neighboring units and desperate attempts to preserve the unexpected windfall. German winter uniform production suffered a paperwork disaster that resulted in tropical climate clothing being manufactured for soldiers facing harsh winter conditions on multiple fronts. Military contractors received specifications for lightweight uniforms suitable for desert warfare when they should have been producing heavy winter gear for European battlefields. This mix-up left German soldiers wearing thin cotton uniforms during freezing winter campaigns, providing no protection against cold temperatures that routinely dropped below zero. Russian supply disasters extended to religious and cultural sensitivities when vodka rations intended for Orthodox soldiers were delivered to Muslim units whose religious beliefs prohibited alcohol consumption, while pork rations meant for non-Muslim troops arrived at Muslim positions where dietary restrictions made the food completely unacceptable. These cultural supply mix-ups created resentment and confusion among soldiers who felt their religious beliefs were being ignored or deliberately violated by military supply operations. Military analysts later determined that logistical errors caused more mission failures than direct enemy action in numerous World War I campaigns, revealing that armies often defeated themselves through supply chain incompetence rather than losing to superior enemy forces. When examining the full scope of military madness across all these armies, certain patterns emerge that reveal which forces truly mastered the art of self-destruction. The final verdict, which army's madness was the worst. Ranking these armies by their capacity for self-destruction requires examining concrete evidence rather than anecdotal chaos. The French army executed 918 soldiers for desertion and cowardice, the highest rate among major powers, revealing a military culture that killed its own men more systematically than any other force. British forces executed 310 soldiers, while German and Russian armies maintained significantly lower execution rates despite facing similar battlefield pressures. Beyond execution statistics, equipment failures and supply disasters plagued every army, but the scale varied dramatically. Russian soldiers marching barefoot across hundreds of miles, while French troops received wine rations stronger than modern spirits, created different types of military dysfunction. German underground cities and British parachute bands reflected institutional problems, but these pale compared to systematic supply failures that left entire armies without basic necessities. The evidence suggests that institutional brutality toward one's own soldiers, measured through execution rates and systematic supply failures, created more military damage than language barriers or cultural confusion.